Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexey, and today I have a special guest, Joost Van Den Broek. Joost is a producer and mixing engineer who has been working with such great metal bands as Epica, Powerwolf, Sabaton, Blind Guardian, and many more. Right now, you may find a session of Epica's song T.I.M.E on Nail the Mix, where you can learn from Joost how to mix T.I.M.E song by Epica. And also you can download original multitracks of T.I.M.E song by Epica to mix them yourself. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Joost. And let's start our interview. My first question is how you became a sound engineer.
Well, I don't really see myself as a sound engineer, more a producer. So I'm really not the most technical engineer, so to say. I really focus mainly on the music, on the arrangement, on the sound, on the mix. But I have a guy here in the studio for me who's really doing like the technical engineering. I actually started off as a keyboard player, and I played in bands like After Forever and Star One, Ayreon. And at some point, I felt like, I really enjoyed the creation. I really enjoyed the creation of the music, and I enjoyed making cool sounds and creating arrangements. And that kind of slowly developed into songwriting, into arranging songs, into recording songs, and eventually also mixing them. And not only doing that for my own bands, but also for other bands that I worked with. And that's how I became a producer.
My second question is how you got into mixing metal.
Well, I always been listening to metal, and I've mostly been playing metal for all my life, mostly progressive and symphonic. And well, one of the steps, obviously, of the whole production process is also making it sound good and mixing everything together. So I've always been somehow mixing stuff when I was creating arrangements and demos, and that kind of evolved into really mixing for bands. And you need a lot of time for that. I mean, I think it's all about trial and error, trying to listen, try to evaluate, try to get better speakers, try to get better plugins, compare your mixes to other mixes and then learn from it. And to be honest, I'm still in that process already for 20 years. I think I never stop exploring that.
My next question is how you started working with Epica.
Yeah, so since I was playing in After Forever, of course, the connection with Epica came much closer. They were playing many festivals with us. We did gigs together. And when After Forever stopped, I really went into production full time. And I did many productions in that style at some point. The earlier like symphonic productions I did were like for Revamp, Floriance, Stream of Passion, all those kind of bands. And at some point, Epica actually needed a studio to record some special song in for a one-off project. They came here to Sandlane, and that's where I really got the connection first about having them here in the studio, and then, the first album. So the first album I did was the Quantum Enigma, and that's already like 12 to 13 years ago, so time flies.
My next question is how do you create a unique guitar tone for Epica? So in this case, do you use real amps or do you use virtual amps? And what is the difference for you on using real and virtual amps?
Well, for Epica, and actually for all productions that I do, I use real amps. For guitars at least. For bass, I like to do a lot of direct boxes, but we can talk about that later. For guitars, I really enjoy real amps, and I have quite a collection here in the studio. Starting off with having a really good Bogner Ecstasy that we used for the first record of Epica I did, and then evolving into also using some EVH models. Now for this the latest album, it's actually a combination of, let me think, the Bogner Ecstasy, the EVH, and Mesa Boogie Mark 6 or 7. I have to check that. And I enjoy having the amps in the room, cranking them up, making the sound, combining mics, preamps, pre-EQing them a bit. And I especially enjoy when a guitar player is really having a good time playing on those amps. Because that is a big difference. A guitar and a guitar player react differently to a real amp sound. And out of that, I always enjoy the end result more. It has a more 3D dynamic sound. And plugins I actually only use for pre-production. Sometimes maybe an effect or a small guitar line or a lead additional to something, but really never as a basis or anything.
My next question is, what tips can you give on tracking guitars for Epica?
Well, it depends a little bit. The last album and also the Alchemy project we did, we really recorded drums, bass, and guitars all together in the same live room. So we wanted to have a more live, more raw, and less perfect sound. And I think it's always been a bit like that with Epica, we really wanted to keep some sort of performance and looseness in there. Although you're in the studio and you want to have it perfectly timed and pitched and everything, we still want to have a lot of attitude there and play like longer takes, not chop it up too much, not edit it too much, but really focus a lot on how it's being played, where the right accents are, that you really hear it's a performance instead of a MIDI production, so to say. And I think for Epica, that performance and having that live energy in there is super important. We don't use like the Evertune bridges, so it's not super tight. There's some vibrato going on. All that kind of stuff, that's very important for the Epica guitars, not overly gained. So the guitar player really has to push it and play it, to get a good attack and a good oomph in there. Not a lot of gain. So it's a little bit of an old school approach to getting a newer, more performance kind of sound.
So in this case, when Epica at the studio is recording their new album, or at least their new single, so how are they working on recording, let's say, of their new single at the studio? Are they playing the whole song from start to finish, or do you record different instruments by parts? For instance, you are recording drums first of all, then guitars, bass, and then and finally vocals. So how do you work on recordings of, let's say, only one single of Epica?
Yeah, so we started off by doing like the layering, so drums, guitars, bass, etc., etc. Those were the first albums, and then we did the Alchemy project, which was like all done in the same room, and we really recorded like the bass, drums, and guitars at once. But of course, then you can still play in sections, so you don't have to play the whole song, but you can play a verse, a chorus, then punch in there. But it's done with the whole band at the same time, which is actually a super interesting, also intense, but very interesting process that gives you a great energy and a great kind of unique blend, sort of. But of course, after those bass, drums, and guitars are done, we still overdub the guitars. We do some lead guitars on top, so it's still stacking those. And one of the things that I've always been doing with Epica is doing quite extensive pre-productions all together in the same room with the whole band. So also including vocals and keyboards. That the band, after the demoing and the pre-production process, really starts playing, working out the songs, also together with me in the room. We adjust small things, we adjust parts on top of each other. And then we grow into the recordings, where before we then did multi-tracking, stacking all the stuff. And with the last album and the Alchemy project, we really recorded the drums, bass, guitar at the same time in the same room. And then, of course, from there, you start doing the arrangements, the orchestra, the choir, the vocals. That's all separate.
How do you create a bass tone for Epica? So in this case, what kind of bass guitar amps do you use? What kind of mics do you use for tracking bass tone? And how close or how far do you put mics around bass guitar amps?
Yeah, so the bass evolved a little bit from a more amp kind of sound in combination with some direct boxes towards an only direct sound. And that also has to do with the tuning going lower and lower and the basses that Rob uses. For the last album, we only used direct boxes. He obviously plays Dingwall basses, so they're already very, they have a quite aggressive and powerful sound coming out of the bass. It's not really clean, so to say. There is already this preamp inside, and most of the basses that he used for the last album, I think, were also active. So you have like already a sound coming out of the bass that is quite heavy. I always like to use a very good DI with a tube preamp and a tube compressor behind. So it really gives this tube kind of richness and already compress it a bit. Then I still use the Sense amp, what's it called? The RBI, the black 19-inch one that has a very compressed kind of low end. And then part of the sound is also the Darkglass X7 is the pedal called, which has the scoop in that, compresses the low end, has the high gain on the high end. And then in the mix, I think I also use some Parallax Neural DSP on the DI. So that's really the sound that you hear. But it's really, a lot is coming directly from the bass guitar, actually. And the direct boxes kind of compress the low end and really saturate the high end. That's really what's happening.
My next question is how to make metal guitars and bass sound huge in the mix.
Yeah, so guitars I never really compress. So sometimes a little bit to get some control maybe over like the mid frequencies a bit more. But I don't really like to compress or limit guitars. What I like is that when I've recorded the guitars, to be honest, the distortion and the gain is already like a huge compression. So it's not super dynamic, right? I mean, the tone is already compressed out of the amp, sort of. And from there, it's mainly EQ and saturation that I use for guitar tones. I really like to saturate the mids and the low mid frequencies to get a really rich mid kind of tone, because to be honest, the high frequencies in the guitars are always there. They're always too much, and it's always, I never really worry about them. I really have to tame them down more than boost them. For me, guitar sound is all about the mid frequencies. So I really shape them with either EQ, saturation, really focused on the mid frequencies, let's say from 500 to 1000 hertz and a bit lower. That is really where I find the tone and how to shape it. And what I always do, at least to get some extra oomph in there, is to use a bit of an expander on the mutes, on the palm mutes, because I really like the palm mutes to pop out, so it really gives you this oomph. And when there's a palm mute, it also really makes the part more precise. Aside from that, it's just really important that they don't have any frequencies that you don't need to have in the mix, because especially with Epica, you have choirs, orchestra, vocals, drums, there's so much stuff. So I really try to filter them, the top and the bottom, as much as I can without really hearing it. So I don't spend any energy or lost frequencies around stuff that I don't need to hear. So probably when you solo the guitar sound, it's not per se super huge on its own, It's really the place that the guitar sound finds in total that make it huge and big. And when then I start, talking about the bass sound, it's a little bit of the same. I really try to have the bass always recorded after the guitars. With Epicas was at the same time, but normally I do it afterwards. So I have the guitar tone, and then I try to shape the bass tone to extend the guitar tone. So the bass tone should give an extra layer of thickness, obviously, where the guitar stops, the bass should start. Plus it gives this extra string attack. Actually also in a range where the guitar is not so super present and clean anymore. And also for the bass, I like to be super select of the frequencies that I hear. So there's a huge peak around, let's say, 80 to 100 hertz or something around that. And there's like a peak around 1.5 to 2K. And the rest is almost out, because those are the frequencies that really have space around those guitar tones. What I do with the bass, at least, is also sidechain it a bit on the kick drum. The guitar is also a sidechain for the arrangement. So it's all a bit of a combination that grabs together to make it come out of the speakers in a huge solid way, So I don't really compress the parts itself. I do, of course, compress the bass a bit more than the guitars. Guitars hardly, but because of the side chaining that works on top of each other, it really works together with the arrangement, with the drums, with the vocals to create a solid, heavy, impressive sound.
What is the difference between mixing live orchestra and virtual orchestra?
So for the last record, and you'll also see that in the song that I'll be mixing for Nail the Mix, I use both. So the whole orchestra and everything is already programmed, and then we start recording a live orchestra, and in the mix you actually hear both. So you have a live orchestra and the programmed orchestra. Sometimes it's more live, sometimes it's more programmed. It depends on the part, what works and what we recorded live. But we spend a lot of time and a lot of budget also recording all the arrangements live. Even we do live percussion and whatever, we really try to do as much live as we can with Epica, and that's also a very cool aspect of this production always. But the big difference in mixing is that when you program and you have all the great libraries that are out there, like Spitfire, East, West, whatever, there's not so much mixing involved, because when you found good sounds, they're mostly already placed in the room, because they're also recorded in the room, sampled like that. it's mainly about balancing and automation, so volume-wise, little bit panning-wise, and adding some extra space, like a good impulse response. But I don't really spend a lot of EQing on samples, because most of the time they really sound great, you know? So I do that sometimes a bit later in the mix, but never in the programming process. But a live orchestra, of course, is much, much, much rawer. So you have to do quite a bit of EQing, getting rid of noise, editing, filtering out stuff, placing it in the right stereo field, adding room, having the balance between the room mics, the far room mic, the Decca 3 and the close mic. So mixing like a live orchestra is quite complex. I mean, it's not like rocket science, but you have to have the image of the orchestra, and you have to do much more than when you use samples, because the samples most of the time really sound good out of the plugin.
So my next question is, if we talk about Epica's song Time, which you are going to mix in a few days on Nail the Mix. So in this case, when it comes to orchestral elements, which virtual orchestral libraries Epica uses for production of their orchestral elements?
Yeah, so I have about every library out there. And maybe not everything of this manufacturer, but I have Vienna Symphonic Library, I have Heaviosity, I have East West, the Composer Cloud, LA Scoring Strings, Cine Tools, Spitfire, lots of stuff. So there is not really one thing that I use. I will also dive into the programmed session actually when I do Nail the Mix, because I think it's interesting to see, for everyone to see where it comes from, not just the stems, because for Nail the Mix I just gave you like a strings stem, but it's like already 50 tracks of strings, for example. So it's interesting to see where it comes from. I always use combinations. So it's never just really one string sound. It's always a stack of like a few different sounds that have a bit of a different character. So for example, for strings, for example, you have like libraries that are really more a smaller sounding real live string sound. When you combine it with a bit more of a Hollywood kind of string sound, you have a best of both worlds. So you have the closeness and the realness, but still the epicness around it. But yeah, like I said, it's consisting of many, many libraries, and every time something interesting comes out or gets released or updated that I think, that sounds good, I will try to purchase it or get it or use it, or yeah. It's an everlasting build and collection.
What tips can you give on mixing orchestral elements?
Well, one of the most important things to start with is that you have a good arrangement, because it's a little bit the same that when you have a good part for a guitar, for a bass that connects with the drums, it's, let's say, works 100 times better together and easier in the mix than when those elements would not really connect. So if the guitar plays too high and the bass too low, or it's not connected with the kick drum and they all play something else, or maybe not even the right notes, or then you never can mix it in a really cool, fat way, So with an orchestra and all the orchestral elements, you have like hundreds, 200 layers of instruments that all need to be written in a good way, need to be arranged in a good way. So there is really where it starts. And that is quite a big job. it's a big skill, and you also have to learn how to do that, where the instruments sound good, how they are placed in the stereo field, what complements the other one, what sounds like this, what sounds like this, what really works, if you know what I mean. That needs to be completely well done in order to also get the mix across, because if you have strings really tight in an arrangement, you're never going to get them sound huge or big, or you're never going to really be able to determine the separate lines of the separate parts. So I think a lot of times people that are not really familiar with orchestras and orchestral arrangements, they kind of skip that part too easily. So they install the composer cloud of East West, and they press like a string ensemble, and they expect it to sound like, and that is really not what's happening. So the arrangement is all that makes it sound great. And then within the mix, I really try to aim for what is needed to be heard, because an orchestra is a full range instrument. It has from the lowest subs in the percussion and double basses and the tubas onto the highest frequencies you can imagine, with the high violins and the flutes and the cymbals and everything. So it's super high end. Orchestras are meant to be standalone originally. So what you have to do is carve out parts that the band needs to be. And that is something I do with EQ, obviously, but also with sidechaining. Because at some parts, the band or the guitars or the bass is not playing, and you want the orchestra to sound full range. So it's really like a full orchestra. Whenever the band kicks in, you still want the same experience of the full orchestra, but the guitar, the drums, and everything has to get the space. So you have to kind of find a way to still hear the orchestra, but find space for the band. And that's done in a pretty rude way, really ducking the orchestra, but not in total, but in frequencies. So multi-band sidechaining. And I will also show that in the Nail the Mix, how I do that, and what I do for that. I use saturation on orchestras, especially live orchestras, to make them more aggressive and more punchy than they could be in real life. I use a bit of compression, limiting could be, but that's really for leveling. So it's not really for the sound, because compressing an orchestra sounds quite harsh in a way, and it takes away a lot of headroom, a lot of shine that you don't want to miss. So I use saturation and compression for leveling, but mainly it's done a lot with automation, EQ, and sidechaining, multi-band compression.
How the choir was recorded for T.I.M.E, Song of Epica?
Yeah. Well, for T.I.M.E, we recorded obviously a classical choir, and we did it here in Sandlane. We had, I think, for that session, 16 singers, and it's divided over sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses, sometimes with a subdivision in there. So every part has 4 singers, and they're all in the same room in a sort of a half circle. We place close mics in front of the singers. We have a few stereo pairs in the middle, and we have some far room mics on the ceiling mostly. They sing that, they rehearse it, they have a conductor, they hear the click, they really give all the power they have. And then we overdub that, I think, 3, maybe 4 times to get an even bigger choir. That's actually how it's recorded. And again, there, the arrangement is super important. The voices are super important to have divided well. And you need just great singers, a great conductor, and then in the room, the magic happens. And I must say, in the mix, I still use a little bit of extra doubling, to have even a bit more voices, because the bigger the better. A bit of saturation, bit of compression, a very good impulse response to add to the room. And that's kind of it.
What gear do you use for tracking Simone's vocals?
Yeah, so for Simone vocals, back in the days, we did like a bit of a shootout for vocal mics and for everything next to the chain. And what I really liked in the end was to have a Browner VM1 big membrane tube mic. It's a quite a modern kind of tube condenser mic that goes into a solid state preamp. Because it's a tube mic, I really like to have a solid state preamp, which is in this case a Manley TNT, the cool channel. And it has a really good switch of impedance, so you can really tweak the sound a bit by the impedance of the mic. And it should be quite bright, but still have a very nice body. And from the preamp, it goes into the TubeTech CL1B, the big blue LA2A TubeTech version, which is a really nice tube compressor that adds a lot of warmth and a little bit of saturation. It also really compresses quite a bit. Not like smashing it, but really levels it out, but also adds some nice body to it. And that actually goes into the computer. So that's the vocal channel.
What tips can you give on mixing a female voice like Simone's in orchestral metal songs?
Yeah, so one of the most important things is keeping headroom for a female voice, because when you do like heavy male vocals and grunts especially, you can really like place them more in the mix, compress the shit out of it, and then place them almost like an instrument somewhere in the mix. But with female vocals, you have to be a bit more delicate. Yes, they need compression, but in my ears at least, it should never be compression that you really hear. So it's more a leveling kind of compression instead of really smacking it, because then it starts sounding a bit harsh and a bit unnatural. At least that's what I like. So yes, there's compression going on. I never really use parallel compression on vocals. So I use a bit of a subtle kind of slower compressor that still keeps the original attack, sometimes two. So one compressor that is a bit more attacky, grabs the attack, and a bit of a slower compressor for leveling and sound. They are quite doing a bit, because the vocal needs to be quite balanced, so the automation is not only about fixing things. The compressor fixes the loudness a bit, and then I use a lot of automation to really get all the words across and all the right sentences and lines. So depends on the part. Sometimes it works. Sometimes when there's a lot of high lows, you need a lot more automation. What is very important with female vocals is that when they start singing high, they keep body. When they are low, they have mostly too much body. When they start singing high, the body disappears. So what I do there is boost the low ends with a Pultec EQ, and try to use multiband whenever it's too much, and sometimes even expand a bit when they go high and the low end is too little. So it really moves, if you know what I mean. Then you want the brightness, so you boost the air bands, in the frequencies, but the S's and the T's can be quite harsh, so you need a good de-esser that ducks the S's again, but also there I always try to make those de-essing never audible, so you should be really careful. You want a processed sound, but it should be natural when you hear it. It should never, but that's also my taste, it should never become processed or smashed or too saturated. It should be open and clean and bright, but never processed. And that's the challenge. So you need headroom in your mix. You have to put it loud enough. That's always a bit of the compromise that you need to make, right? I mean, the band always wants to be heavy, 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 but the vocals should stay on top. So make it bright and compress it enough, but make it be on top. And that's really the secret of it. Don't put it too low in volume. That's a little bit what it is. Because then the voice has room, you understand it, it shines, and it has the leading role.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful interview, Joost. It was a huge honor and pleasure talking to you. Again, if you want to learn from Joost on mixing Epica, you can check out his live stream on Nail the Mix. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.